spots right up there.
I do my homework.
All right, well, thank all of you for coming this afternoon. I tried to piece together a presentation that I would like to have be interactive, more of a conversation than just a lecture. And I've tried to put this together in between candidates showing up to file, so it's a little disjointed. But I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about the New Hampshire First in the Nation presidential primary, not in the context of the colorful history that we have had, but more along the lines of the fundamentals about how we ended up with the primary, and just the general history and how we conduct an election in New Hampshire. And there are plenty of resources that are available to get the colorful history, and one of them is in the room. Terry Shoemaker is trying to text on his phone. But if you want to hear the colorful history about candidates and their activities in New Hampshire and what were meaningful and really important moments, you want to talk with people like Terry and Bill Gardner, Steve Dupree, Tom Rath, that's the former governors in New Hampshire, and they can give you some really neat stories about events that not only happened in New Hampshire with the candidates, but things that actually changed the course of the candidates' campaign. And some of that stuff has already been written about. But I just wanted to talk more about the basics. And New Hampshire has been under a lot of criticism lately, especially on the Democratic side of the equation. And the state is being accused of being too white, our population is too white to be representative of the rest of the country, or maybe we're too wealthy or too privileged. And those are not facts that we should run away from, because that is who we are. But I would also argue that there really is no other state in the country that truly reflects the makeup of America, and that each state's demographics are made up for different reasons. And the New England states generally are where the European settlers came when they migrated to this country from its founding. And if you look at the states along our southern border, I mean, obviously they have more of a Hispanic population, and if you look at the West Coast, there are a lot of people that are from Asia that have settled there. And the true makeup of America, in terms of having a primary or caucus process, is kind of a conglomeration of states, similar to what we have had, with New Hampshire and Iowa, South Carolina, Nevada, and maybe some others. But New Hampshire has held the first presidential primaries. Actually, they've had a presidential primary starting in 1916, and we have been first since 1920. So we're now about ready to celebrate the 104th anniversary of being first. And once that status was established, actually it's almost 50 years ago, Senator Jim Splain at the time sponsored a law that said that New Hampshire's primary shall go at least 7 days before any similar event to protect the culture, the tradition that we had established here over a long period of time. And it was not one that we took from anybody else, but it was one that we kind of inherited, and it just happened. This is important and why New Hampshire should be first. And it's a small state geographically. It has a small media market compared to other states in the country, especially the large ones. We are a purple state politically. We have regular high voter participation, and it is very easy for any United States citizen that qualifies to be able to run for president to actually try and make it happen here. And I like to say that this is the place where any fourth grader, any person that in the fourth grade had the dream to grow up and be president of the United States. New Hampshire is a place where they can come and try and make that happen. And that certainly is reflected by the large number of lesser-known candidates that we have filed for our presidential primary elections. State population right now is just shy of 1.4 million citizens. And on here you can see that the distance from Nashua, which is at the bottom of the map, southernmost city in New Hampshire, up to the northernmost city, Berlin, is 118 miles. Vertically, New Hampshire is 180 miles long and 90 miles wide. So it is a very easy place for any candidate to come here and get around. They can visit several cities in a day. So it's easy to campaign here. There's one statewide television station and one statewide newspaper. We do have media markets that come across the border from Boston and Massachusetts, and then a couple in Vermont and Maine. So you don't have to spend a lot of money with media trying to advertise you. You can get your message out by just a couple of outlets. You can see the voter registration numbers that are most recent is the Democrats and the Republicans are almost evenly split, and the largest block is undeclared voters. So roughly 30% Republican, 30% Democrat, and 40% undeclared voters. This is a chart that Bill Gardner actually put together just to show the voter turnout in New Hampshire in presidential elections going back. In this case, it's to 1996. He has the graph going back much further than that. But what this clearly shows is that for the last 4 presidential general elections, New Hampshire was third in terms of voter turnout. It's consistently up near the top. And what Bill Gardner was trying to show here was that you can see Oregon is also highlighted on the map. New Hampshire's highlighted in yellow. Oregon is highlighted, and I think that's pink. But Oregon and New Hampshire were very close together in terms of voter participation. And then Oregon went to vote by mail. And you can see how we kind of, voter turnout dropped after that happened. And they've never really caught up to New Hampshire after that. New Hampshire does not have vote by mail. We have absentee voting with an excuse, but not just vote by mail. So, to get on New Hampshire's presidential primary ballot, a person just has to meet the qualifications listed in Article 2 of the United States Constitution, 35 years old, natural born United States citizen, and you have to have lived in the country for 14 years. If there's a $1,000 filing fee that goes along with that filing, which is small compared to most of the states, and if a person can show to us that they do not have $1,000, then they can go around to each of the 10 counties and collect signatures from 10 voters in each county, and they can qualify for the ballot that way. So we truly make the process of running for president open to anybody that meets these requirements, and they don't have to spend an arm and a leg. In contrast, you have South Carolina. In some of these states, the parties have a big say in who can participate in those nominating events. In terms of South Carolina, the filing fee is $20,000. There is a way to circumvent that, I think, if they go out and collect a huge number of petition signatures. In Michigan, the parties get to determine who has enough name recognition or who, in their eyes, would make a good candidate. And those people are placed on the ballot. If you're lesser known, then you have to go out and collect again, a huge number of signatures to get on the presidential primary ballot. We also looked into Delaware, and their primary process is really party-driven. They don't have to have a primary if they don't want one. If only one candidate signs up, they declare that person the winner of the primary. So they don't even follow through with the primary election necessarily. I'm just giving you some examples of how other states do this. Nevada, also an early state, was moved up by the Democratic National Committee. For the first time, they are holding primaries, and so they're still trying to formulate that process on how that's going to operate. At the moment, it doesn't look like there's much of a filing fee, but I don't think we were really able to determine what the actual process was to get on the ballot there. This is really important to New Hampshire's culture and its identity, is that we obviously were one of the 13 colonies, and when the colonies decided to break away from England and have a revolution and then create their own governments, New Hampshire created a constitution that went into effect on June 2nd, 1784. That was actually 5 years prior to the United States Constitution being established. And that happened when New Hampshire was the 9th state to actually ratify the Constitution. And that ratification actually made us the United States of America. So we meaning the people of New Hampshire, had established our government before the United States actually did the same thing. The Constitution, as it was drafted in New Hampshire, reflected a general mistrust of government at the time of right after the Revolution. And the Constitution was written in a way to spread the power of government as broadly across the population as was possible. And this theme, I think, goes in line with how easy it is at the present time for anybody that wants to run for president that's qualified to be able to get on the ballot. This is a really long-standing tradition, process, culture, if you want to call it that. Something that I think is very powerful, and something that, especially the Western states don't have, this kind of history and metamorphosis into the government that we have today. We have an incredibly large House of Representatives with currently 400 members, and our Constitution says that number can vary between 375 and 400. But there was a time in our past when every town was entitled to representation, and I think that at one point the legislature could hold as many as 600 members, and that was determined, I think, to be unwieldy. And the legislature went to representation based on population, but kept the tradition that town boundaries could not be broken up when creating legislative districts. And in New Hampshire, all House of Representative districts have to be within county boundaries. We also have a 5-member executive council, which is unique among the states. That's a check on the governor's power. So for any contracts that the state enters into or political appointments that are made by the governor, he needs the approval of at least 3 members of the council to make that happen. We also have a truly citizen legislature where the elected representatives and senators are only paid $100 a year for their service. Some of them get nice parking spots or a seat on the aisle, but New Hampshire has really kept the volunteerism aspect of our government intact. And even though there have been attempts to raise the salary over the years, that has never flown. One representative in the House of Representatives currently represents about 3,450 constituents. Somebody said that if California had the same representation, then they would have to have, I don't know, 15,000 members of their legislature to have the same representation that we have in New Hampshire. Our local government is really important too, because many local offices are elected in New Hampshire. And these elections take place every single year. The length of term varies from 1 to 3 years usually. And most towns still have some form of a traditional town meeting where they actually get together as a community and debate issues and vote them up or down. There are growing variations of that today, but we have still kept that strong tradition of people being able to exercise their voice and their participation when deciding issues that are important to their city or town. Towns can elect many different positions if they want to, and it's not unusual for road agents, police chiefs, dog catchers, welfare officers, cemetery agents, perambulators, which are people that check the boundary lines of the town every so many years. And so it's interesting to look at town ballots and just see what kind of offices they decide to elect in their communities. In terms of elections in New Hampshire, all elections, whether it's local, state, or federal, are run at the local level. And in doing that, the community, the municipality, or the town or the city actually elects those individuals that are going to run the elections in their individual towns or city wards. And so it starts with a moderator who is the chief election official in a town or city. They're the ones that actually run a town meeting, a deliberative town meeting, if they have one, but is also the person in charge at any given election that takes place in that town. And again, it doesn't matter whether it's a town election or a state election. They have a lot of authority and a lot of responsibility, and in New Hampshire, they really do a good job. We also elect a clerk. The clerk is responsible for really organizing the pre-election activities. If it's a local election, the clerk designs the ballots for the town. When it's a state election, all of the state ballots are designed by the Secretary of State and sent to the towns, but they're sent to the clerk to make sure that they're properly stored and safely kept. The clerk is responsible for receiving absentee voter applications and sending those ballots out to the voter and keeping track of them when the voter sends them back, and then delivers them to the moderator on the day of the election, along with the other official ballots. Each town elects 3 supervisors of a checklist, and they serve six-year terms. That's probably the longest term for a local office that is out there. And those individuals are responsible for keeping track of the voter registration list. And they're the only ones that are authorized in the state to put names on a checklist or to remove names from a checklist. And so their primary responsibility is to meet prior to any election or important deadline related to the election process, and review the information that's provided, and then if they're aware of deaths and they confirm it, they can remove those names. If they question a person's qualifications to remain on the checklist, they'll send a 30-day letter to that voter, giving the voter a chance to say, yes, I'm still qualified to vote in that town. If they don't hear a response, they can take the name off. And then there are 3 members on the board of selectmen. Selectmen in a town are really the executive for town government. In the case of a city ward, they're still elected, but only for the purposes of the election process. And this is what their responsibility is primarily, and this is in state statute, that The selectmen in each town and ward shall provide a suitable place in which to hold state elections, and shall see that the same is warmed, lighted, and furnished with proper supplies and conveniences. That has meant different things over time, but today it's, it has to be a polling place that has good lighting, enough voting booths, enough parking outside. And it has to be accessible for individuals with disabilities. And some towns still use their old meeting houses, which meet these requirements. Some of the larger communities in New Hampshire have to use high schools that have a lot more space and facilities. Before I get into this part, I think it's really important to mention that New Hampshire is not a motor voter state. Most other states in the country are required to comply with the National Voter Registration Act of 1993. We were exempted from that act of Congress because at the time we had same-day, election day voter registration. And that was, that allowed us to take a different path. So in New Hampshire, every voter to register to vote has to appear before their local election official, either the town clerk or the supervisors of the checklist. And so there is a face-to-face interaction between the voter and the election official when they're getting approved. There are a few exceptions to that. If a person is absent, they can do it by absentee. But the expectation is that the voter either before an election will go visit the town clerk, or go to supervisors of a checklist meeting, or they will show up at the polls on the day of the election and go through that same process with an election official. In the states that engage or that have to comply with the National Voter Registration Act, also known as motor voter, can go to several different agencies, usually any state agency that has direct contact with constituent service, whether it's Health and Human Services or the Department of Education. Motor vehicles is obviously the big one when people go to get driver's licenses, can simply apply on the spot, not with a local election official, but with the, whoever's taking applications for motor vehicle licenses. Or anybody can conduct a voter registration drive by simply walking down Main Street, or attending a high school football game, passing out registration cards, having them filled out by voters, and then submitting them, not necessarily to the election official in their town, but to just a voter registration agency. And so a lot of voters in New Hampshire don't understand that contrast. And they complain about what can happen on election day registration. You've heard of people commenting about buses coming up to New Hampshire and out-of-state voters getting off to participate in elections. We've never seen any evidence of that. But the other side of that, in these states that can go out and just anybody can collect voter registration cards and turn them in, I think that there's a lot more opportunity for problems to occur in that process than we have here in New Hampshire. So for state elections, the Secretary of State prepares the ballots and distributes them to the cities and towns so that they have them for their individual polling places. All voters cast their choices for candidates on a paper ballot, and there's no exception to that. There's no electronic voting at all. There's no just direct machine voting. It's every vote is cast on a paper ballot, and the way the ballots are counted can vary from town to town. Some towns use ballot counting devices to count the ballots, but we still have a lot of towns in New Hampshire, mostly the smaller ones, that still hand count their ballots. New Hampshire has 13 cities and 221 towns. There are 26 unincorporated places. An unincorporated place is a place that really has not set up a town government. In most instances, they are part of a White Mountain National Forest, and there's actually nobody living there except our native wildlife. But there are probably three communities. There are three communities: Dixville, Millsfield, and Hart's Location, where they have organized for the purposes of elections. So it's kind of like a city ward where they elect a moderator, a clerk, and selectmen, supervisors of the checklist, but their only purpose is to conduct the election in that town. No other responsibility beyond that. In other unincorporated places where there might be a few voters, every unincorporated place is assigned an adjacent town where any voters that might happen to live there can go and cast their ballot for that unincorporated place. So we accommodate where those voters can go and participate. And then in New Hampshire, we have 300 physical polling places that represents all of the towns and the city wards, and then those three unincorporated places that conduct their elections. And every polling facility in New Hampshire has to be ADA compliant. The Attorney General's office works closely with the Secretary of State's office because they are the enforcer of the election laws. And they have a small army of individuals from their office, Secretary of State's office, that actually visit as many polling places on election day with a checklist, just making sure that all of the statutory requirements are being met there. So I want to jump now to what actually happens in a polling place on election day, because everybody knows that you show up, you go to the check-in table, you announce your name, you receive your ballot, you go to the voting booth, you mark your choices, and then you go visit the moderator on the way out, and you either put your ballot in the ballot counting machine, or the moderator will take it and drop it into a wooden ballot box. But what most voters don't realize is that there are checks and balances at play in the polling place that should help give them confidence in the process. And we start off with the ballot clerks, more formally known as inspectors of election in the statute, are the ones that, where the voter checks in, they announce their name, one of them crosses the name off, and the other one hands a ballot. They are actually appointed by the two political parties. And so it is very usual that you have a Republican sitting next to a Democrat in that process, and they're keeping their eye on each other, but they're also watching what's going on in the polling place as well. And then in addition to that, the political parties get to appoint official challengers, and those individuals get a little special treatment at the polls because they get to sit in close proximity to the ballot clerks, so they can observe that process. If there are voters going through that they have reason to believe are not qualified, they can make a challenge. Mostly what they do is they have their own list, and they're looking for their party's supporters that are going through to vote. And if they see people are not showing up, they list they hand off that list so that some of their help can go and make phone calls to get their turnout up. And then any voter that from that polling place can challenge any other voter's qualifications there, as long as they have cause to make that challenge. And a challenger has to fill out a form that states what the evidence is, what the reason is that they're making that challenge. And then the moderator by statute has to rule on that request. And anybody can observe the process of what's happening in that polling place from outside the rail. Inside the rail is the actual area where the voter is actively participating in the voting process. And then once that's done, they exit. But in terms of watching people being able to put their ballots in a machine or in the ballot box, watching a person check in or observing who's coming through and registering to vote. All the way through the process when the polls close at the end of the night, emptying the ballot box and counting the votes. That is all done in the open. There is not any part of that process that is taken behind closed doors. And then the results are announced at the end of the night and posted at the polling place. Once the polls close, the election process is continuous. So from the time that the moderator opens the polls in the morning, checks the ballot box, makes sure that they have a ballot counting machine, that the tape is reading 0, through the end of the night when all of the ballots are counted and the results are announced by the moderator and actually posted in the polling place so that the voters can actually see what the results are. The moderator and the clerk will fill out a return of votes that has all of the results from the election, including information about how many voters participated, how many were Republicans, how many were Democrats, when we're dealing with the primary election. And the information that is on that return of votes should match the information that is posted at the polling place. The moderator seals that, and then somebody from the town, usually it might be the police chief, will take it to a drop-off point that is predetermined by the Secretary of State's office. And we work with the Department of Safety, the state police, on where those drop-off locations are going to be. And then in the early hours of the morning, there will be state police details that will go around to each of those drop-off locations, pick up the return of votes, and then they will deliver them to the Secretary of State's office before our office opens in the morning. And then the staff in the Secretary of State's office will take the return of votes, they will organize them by county, they will separate them by party, and then we will go through the process of adding up all of the information that is on the return of votes so that we can certify a winner. That is also a public process, so individuals that are interested in that can come to the Secretary of State's office and watch that process take place. They can see the data that's being entered on the spreadsheets from the towns to make sure that it matches what was posted at the town. And then sometimes, this is a very human process, so it's not unusual for there to be errors on the forms that are submitted. And if we identify something that is just glaringly wrong, or maybe a clerk will figure out that they made an addition error and will notify us, we will make changes, but only when the election officials in the town have signed off and explained what it was that happened in that process. So that is meant to be just completely transparent and open and a process by which anybody can follow. Once the results are known, the candidates that are involved in any race in any given election have the opportunity to request a recount. And it's a very easy process. New Hampshire conducts more recounts by far than any other state in the country, just by virtue of the number of positions that we elect, whether it's the presidential primary or our state election process. And the same thing happens at the town level. So we know how to conduct recounts. And we have had recounts in the past for presidential primaries. There have been a couple of major candidates that have requested them because there might have been supporters that talked about some current concerns that they had in particular towns or regions of the state. And in those situations, the candidate has asked that, when we do the recount, if we start with those towns because they just want to verify. Once they see that the counts reflect what was reported on election night, they usually call it off. We have had situations where we have had some lesser-known candidates that are trying to make a statement that have forced us to go through an entire process of a full state recount for presidential primary. In the end, the results change very little. So we have very high confidence that the way our process works is a true reflection of who wins a primary, and there are appropriate appeals in place to deal with questionable issues that might come up. But it's not perfect. I don't know that elections are designed to be perfect, but the important thing is that when you report the outcome, it reflects who actually won the election. So with that, why don't we just take questions? Got that process for Judy?
So on that last point, if a town, a very large unnamed town, says it is their policy that they will not post the tapes at the site, is that are they allowed to do that? Because it seems to run counter to everything you said about if they never show the tapes in public, they pack them up with the ballots and they go off to their offices. You've kind of lost that feeling of observable.
So there is one instance where that might occur. In a conventional polling place where it's a single town and they have one polling place, or if it's a city ward and there's one polling place in the ward, then absolutely the results that are from that election that are counted there should be posted at the end of the night. Tapes and any hand count ballots that had to be added into that process. There are a few communities in New Hampshire that have what are called additional polling places, and that would be a town like Salem or Merrimack, where our law says that you cannot break up municipal boundaries within a polling place unless wards are created, which is, once you create a ward, it's an official subdivision of that community. But the law allows for a really large town to have more than one polling place. And the ballots are exactly the same. They break the checklist up regionally so that the voters know which additional polling place that they can go to vote. But the law gives them the option of either counting the votes at the additional polling place and then sending the results to the central polling place to be added in to the overall aggregate total. Or the additional polling place can pack up the tape, the ballots that need to be hand counted, take that to the central location, and then open it up and complete that process there. When that happens, the statute is very clear. It talks about how that is supposed to be done and transported. I believe there have to be witnesses from both political parties. I'm not sure if the police are involved in making the transport, but the idea is meant to make sure that there's objective eyes on that process so that numbers aren't being changed between point A and point B. Yeah.
When can we expect to know the date of the primary?
Sometime after the filing period closes. I am getting close to being able to say when that is, but I'm still looking at a couple of things.
Can you kind of explain that process? What things need to kind of come to you before you can make that decision?
There are potentially some states out there that still have the opportunity to move. I'm not going to say which states those are, other than Iowa was one that we were really concerned about on the Democratic side, because they have changed up their caucus, their traditional caucus, to implement what's really a mail-in vote primary. There was some question about when that was going to occur, but at a recent meeting that they had, they announced that they're going to have a mail-in option, but they are going to receive ballots up until, as long as they're postmarked, on or before March 5th, which is Super Tuesday, I believe, which puts it well after New Hampshire's primary and no longer threatens it. If they were going to do that same thing on the same day that the Iowa Republicans are going to hold their caucus on January 15th, I mean, that's something that would be, a serious challenge to our First in the Nation primary, and that would have had to have been dealt with. So now we're just kind of going down through the list to see if there's any other states out there that might be, that haven't locked in yet. And once we're comfortable that the other states are locked in, then I'll feel comfortable announcing the date of the primary.
As a follow-up to that, so are there any states that are as nimble as New Hampshire in terms of being able to set the date as quickly as we can? And are there any states you're worried about on that front?
There's at least one other state where the secretary individually gets to set the date of the primary, and that's Georgia. They're pretty well locked in, I think.
Can you explain for me a little bit about the different parties and what happened this past year with the Democrats and the Republicans on this issue about our law about First in the Nation? I'm not clear on how that all.
Well, the Republicans, there really has not been an issue of challenging New Hampshire's First in the Nation status on the Republican side. And the Republican National Committee seems to be content with the Iowa caucus, the traditional Iowa Republican caucus, followed by the New Hampshire Republican primary, followed by South Carolina, and then Nevada. And there really has been no issue, no challenge there. But the issue has been on the Democratic side, at the Democratic National Committee level, where there has been very open frustration that other states are not able to knock New Hampshire off its perch as First in the Nation. That they were successful with Iowa, and I think that's unfortunate because in the past, we have been able to support each other in that process. There's no question that there have been states that have just wanted the status of being first, and Nevada is one state, and Senator Harry Reid, when he was still alive, was just very active promoting Nevada moving up in the calendar and pushing New Hampshire back. Similar attempts from states like Michigan. South Carolina this time was a surprise, but that's because that was the choice of President Biden to lead things off. In the past, other states have tried to challenge New Hampshire kind of independent of the Democratic National Committee in an organized way. Delaware, Florida have been states that have tried to jump ahead unsuccessfully. And the rhetoric that comes out of the Democratic National Committee focuses on just New Hampshire being too white. That seems to be the argument they use. We are not reflective of the rest of the country. And some people might consider that insulting. That is the focus. And I made the comment as I began talking that there really is no state that truly reflects the makeup of America. And each state is unique, has its own demographics, and those demographics have occurred to variables that are unique to each state. And I don't think New Hampshire should apologize for our ethnic makeup or our educational background or how wealthy individuals are. That's not what this is about. The national committees, I can understand party politics, and the political committees want to be able to control who their nominees are. They want to make sure that the person that is going to be their nominee has the best chance to become president, and that's fine. But why New Hampshire should continue to fight for its status is because it's not party-driven. It is for the voter. It's for the average voter out there. It's for the average United States citizen that wants to have an opportunity, independently of the party politics, to be able to have a fair shot to become president of the United States. And that is the real reason why New Hampshire is in the position that it is in. And it is the culture that has been established here. I mean, it is amazing how in tune New Hampshire citizens are to who's running, who's on the ballot. They're not afraid to express preferences, and I think that any candidate, whether it's the president or the former president, or if it's one of the lesser knowns that have come in, if that person walks down Main Street and wants to engage with a New Hampshire voter, they're going to be received and treated politely and with respect, and that's the role that we play.
But this year, the calendar was in fact changed. The first time one of the committees made a real serious movement, one that they've stood by. You've been in the Secretary of State's office in one or in one position or another for years. Do you think that the fact that we've had 10 years of unanswered allegations that the state is too white, not sensitive enough to minorities, it's the wrong place to be, literally attacking the voters, from people like the two former DNC chairs, and the people here in New Hampshire who are in political leadership have not confronted those. They have not stood up and said that's not. In fact, when asked, they said, "Oh, no one's even saying that." Do you think that allowing that argument to be made unanswered for a decade built up to the point where now we actually saw one of the two parties pull the sanctioned primary away?
Nobody's going to defend New Hampshire but New Hampshire. That's clear. And people have been defensive about the accusation of being too white. And so that is one of my goals, is, as Secretary of State, to start standing up and, trying to articulate.
But if Democratic U.S. senators and House members did that and had been doing that for the past 10 years, would that have helped?
Certainly, if our representatives in Congress or to the political parties make that argument, it only helps. The one thing that I have sensed is that both political parties in New Hampshire do support the first of the nation primary, and I think that we can make an organized argument collectively on why that should continue. It has to be on the state to defend itself and make the argument why it's important for New Hampshire to be first. And it's not because of our ethnic makeup. It's because we're for the average citizen of the country that should have an opportunity to run for president if they want to, and not have that dictated by a political party.
I have two questions. So first of all, can you confirm that Biden is not filing for the primary here in New Hampshire? And then also, if the state goes ahead with their own Democratic primary that's unsanctioned by the DNC, what does that look like? How does that play out?
So I can't confirm what the president is going to do. He has until Friday to get his declaration of candidacy in. If he does not submit it, if we don't receive it by Thursday, he'll have to show up here in person on Friday. And we would encourage him to get his declaration of candidacy in. I mean, I think it's, personally, I think it's a mistake that he's not putting his name on the ballot here. So in terms of what does New Hampshire going this route on its own mean, we're going to have the first of the nation primary in 2024, so that chain is unbroken. I think we face significant challenges in 2028 when we go through this process again. At that point, no matter what, it will be a wide open primary on both sides. And that could be a good opportunity for us, because there's no question that New Hampshire does not have that many delegates to send to the convention. And what's more important to candidates is that they get the media attention. And so, you know, even if the DNC says, you know, New Hampshire's totally out next time, we're still gonna hold the first primary. And I think those candidates that want to get a leg up will campaign here just to get the media attention, regardless of whether they get delegates or not.
I have a question to something you said earlier about, you know, anyone can challenge anyone else's another voter's qualifications. How often does that happen? And then who sort of arbitrates that? Does the town decide whether that's a valid challenge, or does the AG's office? Like, what kind of grounds do people challenge each other?
It does happen. It does not happen a lot. It's the moderator in the polling place that will make the ruling based on the challenge. There was an incident at Granite College, I'm trying to say, it might be pushing 20 years ago now, where there were individuals challenging voters going through the polling place based on whether they looked like they were college age or not. And it wasn't because they weren't old enough, it was because they were questioning whether college students actually lived in that college town. And the Attorney General's office had to go up there and kind of mediate it because it was slowing down the process. And so there was some legislation that was filed after that incident to require that a challenger fill out a challenger form and state the reason why that individual was being challenged. And it had to be a real reason. It couldn't just be, it looks like college age student. And that kind of tempered that activity quite a bit. But it is still used. Every election, somebody uses it somewhere.
A follow-up to the current issue with the DNC. Primary comes around, who decides who gets the delegates? There's not necessarily a clear agreement on which organized contest was the right one, if you will.
Well, the Democratic, in this case, the Democratic National Committee can make that determination. And they are discussing what penalties they might place on New Hampshire if we don't fall in line with their calendar. That could be anything from not allowing some or all delegates into their convention. That has happened before, and the delegates went to the convention anyway and ended up being seated. And so, I mean, if you think about the possible scenario, I mean, it's possible that even though the president's name is not on the ballot, if he doesn't file here, that he wins on a write-in vote. And if he wins on a write-in vote, he's going to be awarded delegates. And I would expect those delegates will probably show up at the convention. And then the decision has to be made if that was the penalty, are they going to seat those delegates or not? And you can think about the different scenarios that might happen under that, but I don't think it would be good optic, if there are delegates that were legitimately won that aren't seated at the convention. But we'll have to see how that plays out.
Yeah, Secretary Scanlan, could you talk a little bit more about that write-in process, like how those votes would be processed and reported?
So in New Hampshire, it is not unusual for voters to write in names of candidates. On the presidential primary ballot, there will be the list of all the candidates and then a line for write-in. And if 50% of the voters write in Joe Biden's name, then the towns will be prepared to count those write-in votes up at the end of the night when the polls close. Because the presidential primary is just one race, and it is vote for one, it would be a sort and stack count. So the moderator would go through the ballots and identify those ballots that had write-in votes for Biden. There would be observers to that. They would count they would stack up the pile, and when they had gone through the pile of ballots, then they would simply count those. Usually they do it in stacks of 25, just so they can keep track, and then they'll report the number of write-in votes for that candidate. It's a pretty easy thing, and one thing that we will be recommending strongly to the local election officials before the primary election is that they enlist additional help to be able to speed up the write-in counting process.
You mentioned the question about college-age kids, and that was, of course, revolving around the issue of residency versus where you were domiciled. Would you care to have a whack at that fun question here in New Hampshire?
Well, I think that the legislature and the courts have kind of cleaned up that question. And so it doesn't matter whether you are a college student or not. To vote in New Hampshire, you have to be at least 18 years old. You have to be a United States citizen. You have to have your domicile, which the court said means your residence in the town that you're voting in. So if a person meets those requirements and they show up and vote, then they're entitled to vote. College students do have a choice, both through court rulings and in statute, that they can choose whether they want to be a resident of the community that they're living in while they're going to college, and if that's the case, they're entitled to vote.
Well, in 2020, Tulsi Gabbard was a sitting member of Congress from Hawaii running for president in New Hampshire, and she rented an apartment here while she campaigned. And we checked into it and determined that based on the law at the time, she could vote for herself in New Hampshire while representing the state of Hawaii in Congress. Is that really how loose the domicile residential laws are?
There was a point in time where the law was that unclear. That has been corrected, both by the legislature and court ruling. And so, from my perspective, I think it's clear. And so, the college student has the choice of voting in the community they're living in while they're going to school, or by absentee ballot from where they came from. Ethan?
Oh, actually, sorry, you waiting well.
Has Representative Dean Phillips scheduled a...
You have a quiet voice.
Has Dean Phillips scheduled a time to come in and file for the primary ballot yet?
He has not actually scheduled a time with my office. I know that he has scheduled some space on the front lawn of the State House. And, I've heard the reports that he's thinking about coming to file this week, but, we'll see what happens. I think that would be a healthy thing for the New Hampshire primary.
So right now, we have 23 candidates, is that right, and 7 Democrats? Or no, 24 because of Trump, because...
There are, on the Republican side, there are 17 or 18 candidates that have filed, and on the Democratic side, I think there's 7 or 8 that have actually filed. And typically, towards the end of the filing period, we have some lesser-known candidates show up, and I fully expect those numbers are going to go up a little bit.
Does that include the people who haven't showed up with the money?
There are 2 people that I'm aware of that have submitted declarations of candidacy without the funds. They're not on the list until we receive the funds. Ethan?
I want to go back to your discussion about the write-in process. So you said that it's your advice in your office that town and municipal officials stock up on staff, maybe hire more staff or more volunteers. Those towns have been struggling for years to get volunteers for elections, and with an unprecedented write-in campaign, I believe it's unprecedented, how should they really scale up? Is that really realistic to ask of them? And what happens if they don't have enough staff on election night for a potentially massive write-in campaign on the Democratic side?
We're preparing them well enough in advance so that they can be prepared. It sounds like it would be a big job, but you have to remember it is one race where it's vote for one, and it is fairly easy to sort through ballots, find the vote. And if it's a write-in, you just put it in the appropriate pile. and then it's a matter of counting it up. So it's going to be some extra work. I don't know that it's going to be.
It would seem to me that municipalities, which normally rely on ballot counting machines, are now going to have to effectively hand count their entire wards. But that would be a problem, right? Because every single ballot that has a Joe Biden in there is going to have to go into a pile and then have to be hand counted, right?
That's the way it would work.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not trying to dissuade from your optimism, but do you have any concerns about that? Because that seems like that could be a slow process.
I think that's, that is a challenge that can be overcome. And I fully expect the towns are going to be able to get the volunteer resources they need to help with that.
Another follow-up there. So during COVID, there were some accommodations made to try to make the voting, especially with all the absentee ballots, the voting process smoother. Do you think there should be any accommodations in the face of this potential write-in campaign to allow moderators and clerks to process these ballots in a smoother way throughout the day rather than wait until one big pile at the end?
I don't think anything's going to change there for the presidential primary. And that is always a discussion before the legislature on whether there should be pre-processing and things like that. But I just don't think there's enough time for the legislature to make changes that would allow that to happen. Emma?
Secretary Scanlan, do you believe that New Hampshire will continue to face challenges from the DNC and other states moving forward, looking into 2028 and beyond?
I think they'll continue to pose challenges until they get tired and give up. We won't.
Can you give us a little bit of background on you and your experience? How long were you the deputy under Secretary Gardner, and how many of these you have done?
So I was in the legislature for 8 terms, 16 years, before I came on board as Bill Gardner's deputy. And I served as his deputy for 20 years. And then and became Secretary of State. And so I have been through at least 5 presidential primaries. I had the benefit of just observing Bill Gardner do his job, and that was an education in itself.
And this would be your first, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Have there been any changes to any of the voting infrastructure since the midterms, in terms of counting machines or?
Not that will be in place for the presidential primary. There was a law that was passed that allowed for towns to use electronic poll books for voters checking in. And the e-poll books have not gotten the official certification yet, but the law allows them to be used in parallel with a paper checklist, which seems duplicative, but the towns that are using them have found a real benefit in their efficiency. So where the savings for them, even though they have to do that dual process, where the savings is for them is that a voter can show up at the polling place and actually go into the shortest line to check in. They don't have to get in the line for D through M, which may be out the door when A through C is empty. And so the flow has improved. The flow of voters going through a polling place has improved because of that. And then the real benefit is at the end of the night, instead of having to go through 100 pages of the voter registration checklist, counting the names of how many voters participated in the election, they can simply hit a key on the e-poll book and have that number pop up instantly. And then we have developed an interface with the voter registration database so that the information that has been collected on those voters in terms of voter history can just be uploaded and not have to be manually entered into the process. So the towns have seen some real savings in that regard. In terms of major statutory changes in how the election process works, there really hasn't been any. As you may or not know, that the legislature has been almost evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. And so, any legislation that is seen as controversial on either side just doesn't have any legs.
Do you think it would be certified before the general next year?
Are you talking about the e-poll books?
Yeah.
I'm not sure, but regardless, the towns can continue to use e-poll books in the manner that I just described, and they're finding a benefit to doing that. So the larger communities have started using e-poll books, and if I had to guess how many voters are actually checking in with an e-poll book now, I would say probably about a third of voters in New Hampshire are checking in with an e-poll book.
Secretary Scanlan, toward the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned Article 2 qualifications. Could you walk us through the process if you had to disqualify a presidential candidate under Article 2, what that process would look like?
So Article 2 says that that a candidate for president has to be 35 years old. They have to be a natural-born United States citizen, and they have to have lived in the country for 14 years. And then they sign the Declaration of Candidacy under the penalties of perjury. And we take that filing at face value unless there is some information that is presented to us that might suggest otherwise. There was a candidate some years ago who filled out the Declaration of Candidacy and happened to leave some campaign literature in the office, and when we read it, we learned very quickly that that person was born in a foreign country and had been naturalized in this country, which disqualified him. And so that's the only way that we would disqualify a candidate, is if we had actual evidence to suggest that that person was did not give us the accurate information on the Declaration of Candidacy.
And so procedurally, how would you go about carrying out that process?
We, in that case, because this doesn't happen very often, and that's really the only case that I can remember this being done, is we notified the candidate and said that if they disagreed with that interpretation of the Constitution, that they could go to the Ballot Law Commission and make their argument. And I don't recall now, I believe that there was an appeal made, and I don't recall whether it was with the Ballot Law Commission or the court. They could also go to the court. But the decision by our office, was upheld.
And so is there a specific statute that authorizes the Secretary of State's office to initiate that process under Article 2?
I would have to look at the statutes. I mean, it's a provision that is in the Constitution, in the United States Constitution, and I'm sure that our state statute just mirrors that, those qualifications for the primary. But I'll see if I can get that information for you. Ethan?
I have some more questions on the writing process. So what does New Hampshire statute say needs to be on the ballot for a voter to validly cast the ballot for one person? They have to have the name, I assume, spelled correctly.
So this is a write-in vote question?
Yes.
Yes. So the principle that is used for counting votes is what was the voter's intent. And if somebody writes in Joe Biden for president, that intent is very clear. If they write in just Biden, I think that intent is very clear. If they write in Biden, B-I-D-O-N, I think the intent is still pretty clear. If they just write Joe, then you have to ask the question, well, are there any other Joes on the ballot or running? If there are, then you probably don't know which Joe the person's voting for. But it comes down to the moderator making an interpretation of what the voter intent was when counting those ballots. And then you know, if there's some question about whether they were counted properly, or if the count was close, then the candidate can always request a recount.
Yeah, and we saw a lot of that in the midterms last year with the ballot law commission getting involved on some of these. Do you anticipate a lot of that? If there are some people who write JB or Joe or something that's not clear?
You see a lot of different variations when counting write-in votes. Yeah. And some of them are difficult, some of them are challenging.
They just write big jerk, who gets that vote?
I won't speculate on that. Yes.
No canon, statutory answer.
Ally?
So, also with the write-ins, is the process that you described, is that always a process, is that a process that has happened before on election night, like election night write-in counting?
In New Hampshire elections, there are a lot of write-in votes. And so the moderators are used to counting them up at the end of the night. There is, for the state elections, and this is a little bit different from the presidential primary, but for the state elections, if the moderator notices when counting the votes up at the end of the night that there is a candidate that is getting a significant number of write-in votes, it might be as many as 5, then they are supposed to report those numbers to us along with the return of votes so that we can see if there's a potential write-in candidate that might be getting enough votes to win an election. If candidates are getting 1 or 2 or less than 5 votes, then they still have to send us that information, but they have a couple of days to organize that and report it to us.
And since I asked you at the front end, what the towns have to do when they get these random ballots, then it comes to your office to certify. Are there any challenges that you foresee there on election night or the day after?
We would only see the challenges if the candidate decided to request a recount. My office does not look at ballots after an election's over unless they're unsealed for the purpose of a recount. What we look at in the first instance are the return of votes, and then less urgently, the moderator's worksheet.
Your office announced 4,000 Democrats have switched to Republican who are undeclared just this month. And how does that compare to last year? How does that compare to years past? Is that something that your office is comparing data on?
In New Hampshire, a little preface to the answer. In New Hampshire, undeclared voters have the opportunity to go into a polling place on the day of election, a primary, and request either a Republican or a Democrat ballot. And what they're doing when they do that is they're actually saying that for this election, I'm affiliating with either party. Once they vote, they have the opportunity to change back to undeclared if they want to. If they don't, they remain in the party in which they voted. A Republican or a Democrat walking into a primary election on the day of the election to vote can only vote in the primary in which they're registered. So Republicans, only Republican primary, and Democrats, only the Democratic primary. There is an opportunity for voters to change their party affiliation right before the filing period to run for office opens up. And that's advertised. That event is advertised so that they have warning that if they want to change, now's their opportunity. Otherwise, they're locked in to a party affiliation. So if a Republican wants to change to a Democrat before the primary, they have to do it before the filing period opens up, and vice versa. Sometimes members of a party will just change to undeclared so that they keep their option open as to which party primary they want to vote in. So after it became obvious that there was an organized effort for this election to get voters to change their party affiliation, we looked at at those change numbers after after the supervisors of the checklist session closed, just to see how many actually did it. We had not done that in past elections. There was no, there's really no reason, but because there was an organized effort and people were asking, we thought we would just check. And there were just under 5,000 voters that changed their party affiliation. I believe it was 3,500 voters that went from Democrat to undeclared. There was another 400 voters that went from Democrat to Republican. And then the balance, between just under 4,000 and the balance of almost 5,000 were movement from the Republican side to either undeclared or Democrat.
So there's no data from years past to kind of compare?
No, there was no data from years past to compare it to. Judy?
Do you think the 39% undeclared will think it's, for whatever reason, they'll exercise their option to go to the GOP more often? And are you printing extra GOP ballots? It just seems like a more interesting race if you could do either one.
Yeah, I mean, you can speculate all you want on that. I don't know how that's going to play out in the end.
Well, just out of curiosity, how do you decide how many to print? Like, if you say, well, let's print this many, this color, this many, this color, yeah.
Go back, first of all, look at the total number of voters that are registered, and then I will go back and look at similar elections in the past, and then I always print a percentage more than what I think we're going to need. Not because I don't think that the ballots that we print are accurate, it's just we cut it too close, the town clerks get really, really nervous. And there's a process in New Hampshire. If you run out of the official ballots on the day of the election, the fallback is to go to the unused absentee ballots that the clerks have. And there have been instances where they've run out of those as well. And in that case, the clerk ends up copying ballots and then endorsing them by putting the clerk's initials on the ballot. But those all have to be hand counted. So they like to make sure they're going to have enough to get through, and we try and accommodate that.
Follow up on the poll book question.
Yep.
So the Ballot Law Commission approved a new voting machine to be used by Voting Works. First of all, are you hearing any interest from cities and towns in this and replacing the Dominion machines? And would those municipalities have that in place by the primary?
The Ballot Law Commission gave conditional approval for two devices. One is a Dominion device, and the other one is Voting Works, which is an open source software device. They cannot be, the final approval will not be before March 1st, so they will not be available for the presidential primary. And both of them still have some conditions that need to be met, and so they will revisit that March 1st to see whether they've addressed those issues or not.
Is that something that your office would hear about if the municipalities decide to change their machines?
We are aware that the municipalities are very anxious for a new option, and they are already preparing to be able to acquire whichever device they find the most appealing.
They'd have to wait until after March, so presumably after town meeting.
It'll be after town meeting. And I think what a lot of them are doing is having money appropriated in the budget so that they'll have money available to purchase the devices.
Thanks.
All right. Well, that was good. Thanks for coming. And as always, our office, whether it's Erin or Anna or Dave, are available to answer any questions that you have, at any time.